Story 1. Every time I try to come up with an answer to this question, I realize there are just too many contenders for the title. Humanity really knows how to produce some top-notch jerks. Story 2. Pol Pot. Cambodia is much smaller than the playgrounds of people like Joseph Stalin and Mao Zedong, but on a percentage basis within his country, Pol Pot may have had the highest mass murderer statistic ever. He killed about a quarter of the Cambodian population in the late 1970s. Story 3. Not the biggest, but one of the biggest. Henry Kissinger. Another one. King Leopold II of Belgium. And another, politically tied with the first example, Augusto Pinochet. Don't forget the Asian communist dictators Mao Zedong, Pol Pot, the North Korean dynasty. Stalin has his own special high place in assholery. And in Spain we had Franco, his pal Mussolini in Italy. History is too full of prodigious assholes. Story 4. Someone who deserves to be mentioned in these, Francisco Solano Lopez, dictator of Paraguay in the 1860s, proceeds to start conflict with Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay. He refuses to admit defeat, and as a result, 70 to 90% of males in the country are killed. Story 5. Look, we can cite any leader such as Adolf Hitler, Joseph Stalin, Mao Zedong, etc., or even serial killers, but I believe they're in their own class of scumbags. But we're talking about an asshole, not a serial killer or mass murderer, so my choice is Ken McElroy. He was such an asshole that he was murdered in broad daylight in front of a crowd of 46 people, and nobody saw a thing. Nobody was ever charged, and some people said of his murder, he needed killing. Story 6. I found the winner. It's the serial killer from the Toy Box murders. Not to be confused with the Toolbox Killer. The Wikipedia page is tame, but I found the transcript of his tapes he played for his victims. I don't advise you to read it. Last time I posted the link, a lot of people got seriously disturbed, upset, and couldn't handle it. You can look it up for yourself, but after reading all the transcripts, I think you'll agree with me that this guy makes Hitler look like Mother Teresa. Audio recording. Not the real tape, but a good faith re-recording of the transcript. Edit. Don't downvote me if you haven't read the whole transcript. If you read it already, then tell me I'm wrong. Edit. Some of you are getting triggered by some mild suggestions which only scratch the surface here. For those of you who are sensitive, I implore you, do not under any circumstances read that transcript or listen to the tapes. Alright, it happened again. Disclaimer. Don't read or listen to the tapes. Repeat, do not. Edit. Please, please, please do not seek out this content if you're underage. It's grotesque, it's stomach-turning, and it might just warp you mentally forever. Story 7. Look, I agree that intent matters to a point. But when we're talking about numbers like 100 million people, I don't really care if it's incompetence rather than malice. Story 8. Imagine a man who is the wealthiest person the world has ever seen, living in a country with millions of people living in squalor on the streets and children starving, problems which could be solved with less than 5% of his wealth. This person chooses to pay his workers starvation wages and use his wealth to buy up huge swaths of housing that could have gone to struggling working families. Story 9. I remember reading a story about some guy in a small town somewhere who was just such an insufferable person that eventually the whole town got fed up with his behavior and killed him. When the sheriff came to investigate, nobody saw a thing. Darndest thing, I tell you. Story 10. Stalin, nobody else is even close. The most such killing was done by the Soviet Union, approximately 62 million people. The Communist government of China is second, near 35 million, followed by Nazi Germany, almost 21 million, and Nationalist China, around 10 million. Lesser mega-murderers include World War II Japan, the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, World War I Turkey, Communist Vietnam, and post-World War II Poland. In my opinion, Genghis Khan is tied for second with Mao Zedong. Story 11. David Curtis Steve Stevenson, August 21, 1891 to June 28, 1966, was an American Ku Klux Klan leader, convicted rapist, and murderer. In 1923, he was appointed Grand Dragon of the Indiana Klan and head of Klan recruiting for 7 other states. Later that year, he led those groups to independence from the National Ku Klux Klan organization. Amassing wealth and political power in Indiana politics, He was one of the most prominent national Klan leaders. He had close relationships with numerous Indiana politicians, especially Governor Edward L. Jackson. In Stevenson versus State, 1925, Stevenson was tried for and convicted of the abduction, rape, and murder of Madge Oberholzer, a state education official. His trial, conviction, and imprisonment were a severe blow to the public perception of Klan leaders as law-abiding. The case destroyed the Klan as a political force in Indiana and significantly damaged its standing nationally. Denied a pardon by Governor Jackson, in 1927, he started talking with reporters for the Indianapolis Times and released a list of elected and other officials who had been in the pay of the Klan. This led to a wave of indictments in Indiana, more national scandals, the rapid loss of tens of thousands of members, and the end of the second wave of Klan activity in the late 1920s. And in his biography, they note he was released from prison and continued on a career of sexual assault, basically a serial rapist. The woman, Madge Oberholzer, was part of a local government education program. He was so tight with the state government that he may have been on the board or something. He kidnapped and raped her brutally for a couple of days, and she found some poison while he wasn't around and took her own life. In Indiana, the Ku Klux Klan went out of style significantly. Nobody ever spoke of this to me when I was growing up there. It was not part of the Indiana history class curriculum, if you know what I mean. Story 12, Pol Pot. He is not talked about very much as he had a much smaller scope than Adolf Hitler, Joseph Stalin, or Leopold II, but he somehow reduced a third of his country's population. Under his regime, wearing glasses was punishable by death. Story 13, Pancho Villa, anecdotally. Years ago, when I was a nurse's aide, I took care of a guy who had a huge poster of Pancho Villa above his bed. He'd get to rambling about mostly nonsense, but frequently interject, "You know, Pancho Villa was a real asshole." Story 14. Albert Fish claimed to have eaten up to 700 children. Here's Norm MacDonald explaining it. Story 15. Thomas Midgley Jr. killed around 100 million people, decreased the intelligence of an entire generation all around the world, vastly increased violent crime around the world, and caused an environmental disaster we're still dealing with. He did this by adding lead to gasoline. And the second environmental disaster he caused was developing Freon. He knew lead was toxic because he spent several months recovering from lead poisoning. There's a YouTube video titled, "The Man Who Accidentally Killed the Most People in History," that explains it all. Story 16. Ptolemy I Soter, Attila the Hun, Ivan the Terrible, King Leopold II, Talat Pasha, Emperor Hirohito, Joseph Stalin, Adolf Hitler. Basically, anybody who led massive campaigns of death or rape to obtain power and impose their way of life on others, or in some cases, just because they found joy in harming their victims like King Leopold. Emperor Hirohito stands out, though. What the Japanese did to the Chinese during World War II was by far the biggest slaughter of the whole war, yet people rarely recall it in the West because it was so detached from the rest of the world's struggles at the time. From what we know, Japan attacked China for raw materials, but the way they went about slaughtering them compared to others they fought was uniquely cruel. This also makes sense given China and Japan have always been at odds throughout history. For context, it is estimated that between 3 to 10 million Chinese civilians were killed during World War II, and it could even be as large a number as 20 million. Then you account for the Americans, the rest of East Asia, and the South Pacific that were attacked by Japan. There is a possibility that Japan killed more civilians in World War II than their allies combined. But it is hard to say if that's true given how hard it was to keep track of death tolls in the aftermath of the war. Story 17. My neighbor across the street, who sits in his car and plays music very loudly instead of going into his house. He isn't even smoking marijuana or anything, just sitting there. Unpleasant person. Story 18. It's Benjamin Netanyahu. To keep his power, he waged war. To justify his war, he approves his subjects being used as bait. Now he's trying to start another war because the other country resists his advances, kind of like he forced himself on someone who said no. Story 19. There's probably one random dude from the time of UR that puts all the well-known jerks to shame, but nobody knows about him. So I'm going to nominate him. Story 20. Today I learned Thomas Edison electrocuted dogs, cats, and cows. Story 21. The person who invented notifications to let people know whether they saw your message or not. I heard he hated himself after seeing the consequences of his work and left the software industry. Story 22. The person who decided that his nomadic tribe needed to settle into a valley and grow crops instead of hunt and gather. That individual is why we pay taxes now. Story 23. Genghis Khan literally raped, murdered, and pillaged half the known world. In fact, he did so much raping that approximately 2% of all people are related to him. Story 24. Andrew Wakefield single-handedly ignited the modern anti-vaccine movement just to sell a different vaccine by publishing a paper so poorly made that it was questioned by another paper in the same journal. He also abused the children involved in his study. Story 25. Scammers. To prey on people, make them scared, and react to a human weakness of trusting everyone. There is a special place in hell for you. Story 26. Oscar Derlwanger, I think, not only contends for the top spot, but also gets bonus points from me for flying relatively under the radar in terms of modern awareness. Story 27. I would have to say Adolf Hitler. His actions led to unimaginable suffering and loss of life. It is hard to think of anyone who caused more harm on such a massive scale. Story 28. Probably Kissinger. Committer of numerous war crimes, helped orchestrate some of the worst atrocities in modern history, and pivotal to the United States supporting fascist regimes for several decades. Cambodian civil war and genocide? Kissinger. Fascist Chile? Kissinger. Bangladeshi genocide? Kissinger. Invasion of East Timor? Kissinger. As well as several other smaller conflicts around the world. He even delayed the peace in Vietnam for several years, sacrificing millions of people, just so Nixon could become president. Story 29. The inventor of leaded gasoline has essentially caused some of the biggest environmental disasters in history. There is a really interesting 20-minute documentary about his work and the effects it has had on the world. He is tricky because he probably did not mean to cause this kind of irreversible trajectory. However, when faced with the fact that lead was poisonous, he tried to act like it was not and attempted to downplay it. Ironically, he suffered lead poisoning himself.